Can I finally call now on Tom Arnold, who to conclude the presentations at this session. Tom is Chief Executive Officer of Concern Worldwide, which is, I think, the oldest Irish NGO with an agenda specifically devoted to urban development. He's worked for the European Commission and has had a distinguished career in the Irish Public Service, where he held senior positions in the area of agriculture development. Very significantly, at present, he has the task of chairing a major convention which is reviewing the Irish Constitution. But if I can take him away from that high ground to the ground of cities. Tom, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Noel. It's a real pleasure to be involved in this important conference. And I'm actually going to use, untypically, I'm going to use the presentation rather than just talk. But, so maybe we could start. Okay. I'm not going to deal with statistics because you've heard some already, but some of the really key things, 70% of, for example, the urban population of Kenya live in slums. I mean, that's a major issue. And I was really struck by one of the statistics that Asia used, which I wasn't aware of, that by 2013, 60% of the people living in urban areas will be under 18. Well, that poses such a major challenge, I think, in terms of policy and politics for the future. Some dwellers are a critical public health and nutrition concern due to these factors. The sheer numbers, 863 million at the moment in the world, the environmental risks, poor sanitation and hygiene, the lack of safety nets, which it just shows the vulnerability of these people, particularly when things go wrong. And that connects into the whole issue of the vulnerability to shocks. And that, in recent years, has been particularly relevant, as you have had since 2007, 2008, a series of high food prices and variable food prices, and people who spend a large proportion of their income on food because they're poor, it means a particular type of vulnerability. So for an organization like Concern, who, as Noel says, has been working in development now since the late 1960s, we're challenged by needing a new program approach in urban contexts, because it is different than what is relevant in rural societies. And many humanitarian organizations, in dealing with emergencies or dealing with hunger, are dominantly, over the recent decades, dealing with these problems in a rural as opposed to an urban area, in an urban context. And that's why, as we go forward, I think the UN system and the main NGOs working in this area have got to adapt to the new reality that more emergencies and more development issues are going to be in an urban context. So the notion that urban smart policies are needed to address this reality, which is the theme of this particular conference, is of particular relevance. If we could move to the next slide. This is just a slide which just gives you a sense over a 60-year period of what's happening to population development. And you see bit by bit that in Africa as a whole, urban population is going to, over the next decade, be greater than rural population. And in Kenya, they are the trends. Move on, please. This slide attempts to give you a sense of, if you like, the particular vulnerabilities that affect urban people. Disease, obviously, the crowding, poor sanitation and hygiene is a critical issue. And linked to that frequently is the reality that health services are poor and people are socially excluded. And this, of course, is amplified by the fact that in many of the growing urban conurbations, you have not only the existing population, but because of the pull factor towards the capital or towards the city, you're getting a steady increase in population. Urban crime can be a major problem, and that, of course, for poor people, it can be a very real problem. The food price fluctuations I come back to, because they have been a reality over the past number of years, and bringing with it psychological stress, particularly to women who in urban situations are frequently having, for just to keep the body and soul together for themselves and the family, have to work. So when obviously the impact of higher food prices becomes even more significant. And then this other feature, which is happening across the world but is particularly relevant in developing countries, this notion of a double burden, that you have at the same time a significant cohort of people who are undernourished, they do not have enough food, and on the other side of the equation, people who are malnourished, they're not lacking in calories, but they're lacking in the quality of food. And this is giving rise to obesity. I was in South Africa in November, just in Cape Town and Johannesburg, and I was really struck by the evident growing problem of obesity. And I think this is something that many people in charge of urban areas are going to have to pay a great deal more attention to, because down the road, this has major consequences in terms of public health. It's a reality for this country as well as elsewhere, but you know, the paradox is that in many poor countries, this problem is equally going to become a problem. And then, of course, when you do have shocks, and particularly sustained periods of poverty, in urban areas and also in rural areas, you do get high-risk behaviors. You get increases in prostitution, and you get significant abuse of women. Could we move on? These are some of the, in terms of programming, in terms of some of the key issues that we think, particularly in regard to urban nutrition. The challenges. It can be difficult to identify and target exactly who is affected, and frequently, unless agencies have a long-term presence there, that makes it even more so. Poor social cohesion and social exclusion. Again, that can be also very much related to the fact that you have a shifting population. The counterpart of that is, of course, that where urban communities have been settled for some time, they have a sense of solidarity, which is a huge community strength. If you are to talk about safety nets for urban areas, and it is becoming an increasing topic of conversation, both at governmental and internationally, you are faced with the challenge of putting those safety nets based on realities and based on analysis, a proper analysis of the marketplace, etc. And then the other challenge, which I've already mentioned, that the care of children can be frequently affected by the demands on mothers to earn money, often away from home. On the other hand, and this is where again the relevance of this conference is clear, urban properly planned, particularly properly planned projects in urban areas can give rise to opportunities in that you can impact on more people more easily. And the whole role of technology, what the potential that technology now gives, and that is particularly relevant in Africa. I mean, the scale, the speed at which mobile technology has increased over the past even 5 years in Africa is very striking. And there are emerging from not just the technology, but the smart way of using technology is becoming more evident. And also, you know, market-based strategies. Doing what Ada said a bit earlier, enabling people to use their own talents and to use their own opportunities. I'm just going to conclude over the next number of slides, next one please, by just talking a little bit about some of the urban programs that Concern is operating, and talking in particular about what we're learning from those, because the whole point of doing work in any of these areas is that we learn ourselves and that we then can perhaps translate that learning into policy change at national or international level. And these are the project. I'm going to talk particularly about the project in Kenya, where we are looking in an urban emergency. We are trying to understand the nature of that emergency, and so be able to predict what if, where you're moving from a chronic emergency to a more acute emergency. What are the indicators of that, and what then are the relevant policy or program initiatives that should come? And I'll talk a little bit about a particular program that operates in the Korojo slum in Nairobi. In Bangladesh, I want to talk about a couple of slides about a very important program that I've seen there within the last year, a program called Amo Manush. And that program means we are people too. It's about people with very, very little, but it is giving them not only practical help, but giving them a sense of dignity. And then in Sierra Leone, I want to briefly mention health programming and the cholera response last year, and Haiti I'm not going to be talking about, but what was very striking when the Haiti earthquake happened in January 2010, that we were faced there with a set of challenges in responding to it that many agencies were not equipped to deal with, because they were normally dealing with emergency response in rural areas. If I could move on, please. This particular project in the Nairobi slums in Kenya is carried out by Concern and the African Population and Health Research Center, with funding from US OFDA, the Office for Foreign Disaster Assistance, in 2 slums. And the central question we're trying to ask is, how do we know when the situation in an urban slum has gone from chronic poverty to a humanitarian crisis? And so to develop a set of indicators, trigger levels, and a surveillance method to detect urban emergencies in a timely fashion. And the methodology we're using is looking back at the data from the food price crisis and analyzing that, etc. I would say that if you like, in an analogous situation in rural areas, predominantly rural areas in the past number of years, something has been developed called the integrated phase classification of hunger. So that means that, if you like, a situation has been, there's an analytical framework there to know how a food problem gradually develops into ultimately a famine. And that was very relevant in 2011 in Somalia, when by tracking month by month particular indicators, it became clear that the situation was getting to a level of extreme difficulty. And in July 2011, in Somalia, the UN for the first time declared a famine in Somalia. Mary Robinson was there to see that. But the point is that there was a system in place to know how a situation was deteriorating. So what we're trying to do in this case in Nairobi is an analogous situation to that. In the particular program, the realities we're finding in this area, half the households were severely food insecure. And the factors that were associated with that food insecurity were these ones: livelihood source, level of income, dependency ratio, and security. That slum residents generally eat for survival, little for quality. Again, just an indicator of poverty, that people have very little scope. And the food price crisis and the post-election violence in Kenya, in Nairobi, had multiple impacts, and many food houses were using negative coping strategies. And this is a particular project that Concern was implementing at that time, from 2009, 2012. And we were doing it through 3 mechanisms: giving poor people cash transfers, helping them improve their livelihoods, small-scale industry, etc., and by monitoring the nutrition status of people who were in particular need of help, having targeted nutrition programs. It covered about 20% of the population in that particular slum, and we were measuring what was happening. Now, all of this probably is not attributable just to the concern intervention. There were other factors as well, but by being able to measure over this period of time, over a year, this is what was happening. There was an improvement. The average number of meals per day increased from 1.6 to 2.5. The percentage of households who are severely food insecure substantially dropped. Risky sexual behaviour substantially dropped, and the use of child labour also. And if one wants to know more about the detail of that particular programme, there is somewhere in the room here, it was published in this 2011 Global Hunger Index, which is a document produced by Concern and the International Food Policy Research, and it gives you more information about this. Bangladesh slums. I was there exactly this time last year, and this is a couple of slides about this. Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, has something between 15 and 20 million people. Nobody seems to know how many people there are in Bangladesh, but there are in Dhaka. But there are a huge number of people sleeping in the streets. And it is for that cohort of people that Concern has been looking at this project, developing this project for the last number of years. And these are things that are being, and some of it is very simple, some very practical. Birth registration and support, securing national ID cards, provision of night shelter, having something safe, or a place where people can lock up their belongings so they're not stolen by other people. Linking into education programs, referral to health services, and critically, and again it comes back to the human rights issue spoken by Mary Robinson, advocacy for realization of rights and entitlements to reduce stigma and social exclusion. Finally, the last example I want to use is Sierra Leone of last year, a cholera response in Freetown. And obviously, when a cholera response is needed, you have to act quickly. But what was particularly relevant in this one was that we were using digital data gathering devices to identify and map cases and water points at community level. And that gave rise to a whole, I would say, a much more effective response, knowing what to do, where to do it, and when to do it. And again, this really just emphasizes the critical potential that technology has. So just in conclusion, the conclusion has to be that given that urbanization is becoming a phenomenon which is going to become more important, there has to be more focus on it in terms of policy and in terms of political prioritization. And so it has to be fitted into some of the larger things that are happening at international level. One such thing is something called the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, which both Mary and myself are involved in. And this is really trying to give more focus at country level to nutrition, particularly nutrition for the pregnant women and up to the age of 2. And there are 33 countries signed up to this Scaling Up Nutrition. There are plans in each country. It is critical that each of those country plans reflect the reality that urban nutrition needs greater importance. The FAO have a Food for the Cities program, which I think is important. It's talking about urban agriculture, how you can make sure that people in urban areas have access to more regular and cheaper food. The UN Standing Commission on Nutrition has issued a statement on nutrition security of urban populations. And all of this needs to really be brought together at an international level. We do not as yet have a common framework for urban emergencies, and that is necessary. It is being worked on by the Interagency Standing Committee reference group. And finally, and this is where always the rubber hits the road, national policies. National policies need to protect slum dwellers. There needs to be a recognition that you need actually strategies in urban areas and the need to plan for the need of slum dwellers. There needs to be greater clarity of responsibility between roles and responsibilities for urban service deliveries, and national platforms for urban planning and response are needed. And I think this opportunity of you people together from your different experiences represents a tremendous opportunity for information exchange, for experience exchange, and I wish you well. Thank you very much.